Most people move through life believing they are responding to reality in real time. Someone says something to them, ignores a message, changes their tone, walks away from a conversation, and immediately a reaction appears. Anger, anxiety, defensiveness, fear, certainty. We assume these reactions are coming from the present moment. We assume we are simply seeing the world as it is. But psychology has shown something interesting for a long time. People rarely react to events themselves. They react to the meaning they unconsciously assign to those events. That distinction changes everything, because if two people can experience the exact same situation and walk away with completely different emotional responses, then the event itself is not the whole story. Imagine two people sending a text message and not receiving a reply for several hours. One person barely notices it and continues with their day. The other suddenly feels tension in their body. Their mind starts building explanations. Did I say something wrong? Are they upset? Are they losing interest? Same event, different reality. So what happened? Most of what you call your personality is not as fixed as you think. A large part of it is a collection of emotional predictions created years ago. Your mind is constantly asking one question beneath the surface. What does this mean for my safety, my value, and my connection with other people? And it asks this question so quickly that you rarely notice it happening. The human brain is not designed primarily to seek truth. That sounds strange at first because we like to think of ourselves as rational creatures. But your brain evolved for survival before it evolved for accuracy. Survival required prediction. Prediction required patterns, and patterns became shortcuts. Think about a child growing up in an environment where attention is inconsistent. Sometimes warmth appears, sometimes it disappears. That child begins learning invisible rules about the world. Love becomes associated with uncertainty. Attention becomes associated with anxiety. Connection starts feeling like something that must be earned rather than received. Now fast forward 20 years. That child becomes an adult sitting across from someone in a relationship. But psychologically, something fascinating happens. The body often remembers what the conscious mind forgets. The emotional system doesn't care about the calendar. It doesn't care that you're older now. It doesn't care that your circumstances changed. It sees familiar emotional signals and immediately reaches into old files. And suddenly you're not responding to this person in front of you. You're responding to a pattern. This is why people often say things like, I always end up with the same type of person, or why does this keep happening to me? They're asking conscious questions about unconscious systems. And here's where it becomes dangerous. Most people spend their lives defending these patterns because they mistake them for identity. They say, that's just how I am. I'm naturally guarded. I'm naturally anxious. I don't trust people. But what if those things are not descriptions of who you are? What if they're descriptions of what you adapted to? Because adaptation and identity are not the same thing. You can adapt to chaos. You can adapt to rejection. You can adapt to emotional distance. Human beings are extraordinarily good at adapting, but survival strategies that protected you in one chapter of life can quietly imprison you in the next one. The moment you begin to understand this, you stop seeing your reactions as absolute truth. You begin observing them differently. Instead of saying, this is reality, you start asking, what pattern inside me is interpreting reality this way? And that question may be one of the most important questions a person can ever ask. Because the greatest prison is not the world around you. It's the pattern within you that convinces you the prison is normal. Once you begin seeing that many of your reactions are not simply responses to the present but echoes of old patterns, another question naturally appears. If people suffer because of these patterns, why do they keep repeating them? Why does someone leave one painful relationship only to walk directly into another one that feels strangely familiar? Why does a person swear they are done tolerating disrespect, manipulation, or emotional distance only to find themselves standing in the same emotional landscape wearing different clothes? Because human beings are not always pulled toward what is healthy. Very often they are pulled toward what is familiar, and familiarity has an extraordinary power over the mind. Most people imagine comfort as peace, happiness, or emotional safety, but psychologically, comfort simply means known territory. The mind often chooses certainty over possibility because certainty requires less energy. Even painful certainty can feel safer than unfamiliar freedom. Think about that for a moment. A person can become so accustomed to emotional chaos that calmness begins to feel suspicious. They can become so familiar with earning love through struggle that healthy affection feels strange. They can become so used to emotional distance that genuine closeness creates discomfort. You see this happen all the time. Someone enters a relationship with a person who is emotionally available, consistent, and stable. Everything seems healthy. There are no games, no confusion, no emotional highs and crashes. Yet something feels off to them. They say things like, "I don't feel the spark," or "something is missing," but what is missing may not be love. What is missing may be uncertainty. Because uncertainty creates emotional intensity, and emotional intensity is often mistaken for emotional depth. The nervous system becomes addicted to familiar emotional chemistry, not because it enjoys pain, but because it recognizes the pattern. The mind has a strange relationship with prediction. It wants to know what happens next. Even if the outcome hurts, there is still comfort in being right. Imagine someone who unconsciously believes that people eventually abandon them. They may not say it out loud. They may not even know they believe it. But deep inside, that expectation exists. So they become hyper-aware of small changes. A delayed response, a different tone of voice, a slight shift in behavior, and then something predictable happens. Their fear starts influencing their behavior. They become anxious, withdrawn, controlling, distant, or overly dependent. The relationship begins changing under the pressure of those reactions. Eventually, the connection weakens. Then the mind quietly says, "See, I knew this would happen." But notice what just occurred. The belief was never challenged because the behavior itself protected the belief. Human beings are incredibly skilled at preserving their internal stories. We don't just search for evidence that we are loved, valuable, or capable. We also search for evidence that supports our fears. Philosophically, this becomes fascinating because it means people are often not fighting reality. They are fighting their own predictions about reality. This is why some individuals keep returning to the same emotional cycles over and over again. Not because they are weak, not because they enjoy suffering, but because the familiar creates an illusion of safety. And illusions can become homes if you live inside them long enough. The difficult truth is that growth almost always feels uncomfortable at first. A new pattern feels unnatural precisely because it is new. Emotional health can feel boring to someone trained by chaos. Stability can feel empty to someone conditioned by intensity. But discomfort does not automatically mean danger. Sometimes discomfort simply means that an old identity is losing control. And the moment you stop confusing familiarity with truth, you begin stepping out of the cycle, because people do not stay trapped by what hurts them most. They stay trapped by what feels like home. Once you begin recognizing that familiar patterns can quietly control your decisions, another shift starts to happen. You begin noticing something most people spend their entire lives overlooking. There is a difference between experiencing a thought and becoming that thought. There is a difference between feeling an emotion and being controlled by it. And that distinction marks the beginning of real self-awareness. Most people move through their lives fused with whatever appears inside their minds. A thought enters and instantly becomes reality. Fear appears and immediately becomes truth. Anger arrives and becomes action. Anxiety appears and becomes prediction. There is no space between the experience and the response. But self-awareness creates space. That space is small at first, almost invisible. Yet psychologically it changes everything. Imagine standing beside a river. Most people are floating in the water, carried wherever the current decides to take them. They don't question it because they assume the current is who they are. If anger pulls them, they move with anger. If fear pulls them, they move with fear. If insecurity pulls them, they move with insecurity. Self-awareness is stepping onto the riverbank and realizing something profound. I can observe the current without becoming the current. Now suddenly you are no longer trapped inside automatic movement, because observation creates separation. People often think self-awareness means gathering information about themselves. They think it means personality tests, labels, descriptions, and explanations. But knowing facts about yourself is not the same as understanding yourself. Real self-awareness begins with noticing patterns in motion. It is hearing yourself say, "Everyone always leaves," and pausing long enough to ask, "Where did that belief come from?" It is feeling sudden anger and asking, "Am I responding to what happened, or am I responding to what this reminds me of?" It is feeling rejection and asking, "What story inside me just got activated?" Notice how different these questions are from the way most people think. Most people ask, "Why are they doing this to me?" Self-awareness slowly changes the direction of attention. It shifts from external blame toward internal observation. Now, this does not mean becoming self-critical. There is an important difference between observing yourself and attacking yourself. A lot of people believe awareness means constantly searching for flaws. They become detectives of their own weaknesses. They dissect every thought, every emotion, every mistake. But awareness without understanding becomes judgment. And judgment rarely creates change. Think of a scientist observing an experiment. The scientist doesn't become emotionally attached to every result. They simply watch. They collect information. They notice patterns. They remain curious. Curiosity is powerful because curiosity keeps the mind open. Judgment closes it. The moment you say, "I'm broken," the conversation ends. The moment you say, "That's interesting. Why do I react that way?" a door opens, because human beings cannot change something they refuse to see, but they also cannot change something they condemn into silence. The fascinating thing about awareness is that it immediately begins weakening unconscious patterns. A pattern survives by remaining invisible. It survives by convincing you that it is reality itself. The moment you see it clearly, its grip starts loosening. Not instantly, not dramatically, but steadily. You begin catching yourself before reacting. You notice tension rising before words leave your mouth. You recognize fear before it becomes control. You recognize insecurity before it becomes distance. And suddenly life feels different. Because now you're no longer living on autopilot. You're participating. You're choosing. You're becoming conscious in places where you used to be automatic. And that may be one of the most important turning points in human growth. Because the moment you can observe your mind, you stop being owned by every voice inside it. Once awareness enters the picture, people often assume the hardest part is over. They think that seeing the pattern is enough to break the pattern. They expect insight to immediately create transformation. But this is where many people become frustrated, because awareness alone does not rebuild a life. Awareness opens the door. Walking through it is something else entirely. Because now a deeper question appears. If you are no longer completely identified with your old reactions, then who are you becoming? This is where the internal story begins to change. Most people try to change behavior first. They say, "I'm going to stop doing this," or "I'm going to start doing that." They focus on actions because actions are visible, but behavior is usually the final expression of something happening much deeper. Identity sits underneath it all. If someone believes they are unworthy, they can learn all the communication techniques in the world and still tolerate relationships that diminish them. If someone believes they must earn love, they may repeatedly overextend themselves, over-explain themselves, and sacrifice themselves for approval. If someone believes they are fundamentally unwanted, they can receive affection and still struggle to accept it. Because people rarely rise above the story they carry about themselves. Think about how powerful stories are. Human beings organize reality through narrative. We create meaning by connecting experiences together and turning them into explanations. We do it constantly. Someone experiences rejection and says, "People leave." Someone experiences failure and says, "I'm not capable." Someone experiences betrayal and says, "I can't trust anyone." Over time, these statements stop feeling like interpretations. They start feeling like facts. And once a story becomes accepted as truth, the mind begins protecting it. You start filtering reality through it. You notice evidence that confirms it and overlook evidence that challenges it. The world has not changed, but the lens through which you view the world has. Philosophically, this becomes interesting because people are often living inside conclusions they reached years ago. A younger version of themselves wrote a story during a moment of pain, fear, or confusion, and years later, they are still reading from the same script. The problem is that children create explanations with limited information. A child may think, "If someone pulls away, I must have done something wrong." A child may think, "If I become useful enough, people will stay." A child may think, "If I hide parts of myself, I'll be accepted." Those conclusions may have made emotional sense at the time, but survival logic and truth are not always the same thing. And eventually a person reaches a moment where they must decide whether they want familiarity or freedom, because rewriting an internal story feels uncomfortable. The old identity resists change. It whispers things like, "This isn't who you are. People don't change." You'll end up disappointed. But listen carefully to that voice. The old identity always speaks with certainty because certainty keeps it alive. Growth speaks differently. Growth usually arrives as uncertainty. Growth says, "Maybe there is another way." Growth says, "Maybe I don't need to chase approval." Growth says, "Maybe I can create boundaries without guilt." Growth says, "Maybe I do not have to repeat what I inherited." And this is where emotional discipline begins to matter. Not discipline in the sense of becoming cold or detached, but discipline in the sense of choosing actions that align with who you want to become rather than who fear trained you to be. Because every boundary you set, every unhealthy cycle you interrupt, every moment you refuse to betray your own value, you are doing more than changing behavior. You are teaching yourself a new story. And eventually that story stops feeling forced. It stops feeling like practice. It becomes identity, because the most powerful transformation in life is not becoming someone else. It's finally becoming someone who was buried beneath the patterns all along.